On your feet, now!
Officer Taylor kicked the edge of Walter's blanket into the gutter.
That's public property. I have a right to sit here.
Right!
Taylor sneered.
You're a broke-down cripple rotting on my sidewalk. This city doesn't owe trash like you a seat.
Walter forced himself up, cane shaking.
Why now?
2 years and now?
Because a man in a suit complained, and his money outweighs whatever's left of you.
Taylor tapped his badge.
This tin star outranks you. You're nobody.
3 people slowed. All 3 walked on. Walter Johnson, 89, disabled. No family, no address, a dying man, already forgotten by everyone on this street, everyone except Bailey Davis, a 10-year-old black girl, poor 3 blocks away, who hadn't met him yet. In 5 months, 12 black SUVs would stop at her door. Officer Taylor's badge wouldn't be worth the metal it was stamped from. 5 months earlier, the jar had once held peanut butter. Bailey had soaked the label off in the kitchen sink over a Sunday afternoon, scrubbing at the glue with her thumbnail until only a pale, ghostly ring remained where the paper used to be. Now it sat under her bed behind a shoebox of crayons she'd outgrown, and every Saturday morning it grew a little heavier. $3, folded twice the way her grandmother folded bills before tucking them into her coat pocket. Bailey earned it walking Mrs. Alvarez's Beagle Pepper 4 laps around the block. Rain or shine, ever since the older woman's knees had gotten too bad for stairs in January. She'd started counting the money seriously that same month after Ms. Delgado from the community center crouched down next to her at the folding table where the after-school program kept its construction paper and crayons, looked at the pigeon Bailey had sketched on the back of a worksheet, and said, "You've got an eye for this. You know that. Don't let this slip past you," and slid a flyer across the table. Fairview Community Art Center. Summer session. 8 weeks of watercolor and pencil reel paper, real brushes, a real teacher who had gone to art school. $45 due by Friday, May the 12th. Bailey taped the flyer inside her closet door where she'd see it every morning while pulling out her jacket and circled the deadline. In blue pen so many times the paper had started to wear thin at that one spot. By the second week of April, the jar held $36. She knew this the way she knew the number of steps between her building and the corner, the way she knew things a 10-year-old wasn't supposed to have to know, but somehow always did, in a house where money was a conversation that happened at the kitchen table more often than television did. She lived with her grandmother Ruth in 2 rooms above a shuttered dry cleaner on Ashland Avenue. The storefront window still stenciled with faded gold letters, pressed and cleaned. Same-day service. Though the shop had closed before Bailey was born. Her mother had died 2 years earlier. Her heart, the doctors said, weaker than anyone had known, worn down quietly over years before it simply stopped one Tuesday afternoon while Bailey was at school. Her father had never been part of the picture at all, not a fight, not an absence anyone explained, just a blank space where a name should have gone on the forms the school sent home every fall. What Bailey remembered of her mother came mostly secondhand, now filtered through the stories Ruth told at bedtime and a single photograph on the hallway table, her mother at 17 laughing at something out of frame. Beside that photograph sat another one, older, in a cheaper frame. A man in an army uniform, young and unsmiling, squinting hard into a sun that had set decades before Bailey was born. She had never once asked who he was. Some things in a house simply existed the way the crack in the bathroom tile existed, or the water stain on the kitchen ceiling. Always there, never questioned part of the furniture of a life that had started long before hers had. Ruth stretched $914 a month as far as it could go. Rent took $780 of it. The electric bill taped to the refrigerator door with a strip of yellowed tape carried a red stamp that read, "Past due," and a balance of $95 that had sat there, unpaid for 11 days running. Bailey knew these numbers the way other 10-year-olds knew batting averages, or the names of dinosaurs, quietly, constantly, without ever being sat down and told to memorize them. Nobody had explained the family's finances to her in so many words. She had simply absorbed them the way children absorb weather. Every morning, she walked 6 blocks to Jefferson Elementary, tracing the same route, past the same corner, Ashland and Ninth, where the dry cleaner's covered doorway made a kind of shelter, and where, starting sometime in late January, a man had begun sleeping. He kept a shopping cart chained to the base of a parking sign a few feet away, its contents hidden under a tarp held down with bungee cord. He never asked anyone for anything, as far as Bailey could tell. He simply sat wrapped in a gray blanket gone thin at the folds and watched the street the way a man watches something he's still out of old habit guarding. For 2 weeks, Bailey walked past without stopping. She told herself she didn't have anything worth giving. She told herself a lot of things that winter that weren't quite true. Some mornings, she slowed down anyway, just enough to look at him sideways, without turning her head the way she'd learned to look at things she wasn't supposed to be curious about. He never seemed to notice, or if he did, he never let on. He kept his eyes on the middle distance, on nothing in particular, the posture of a man who had trained himself a long time ago to be still. Ruth had warned her about that corner more than once in the vague general way grandmothers warn children about things they can't fully explain. Keep your eyes forward. Don't stop for anybody you don't know. It wasn't cruelty in the warning, just the accumulated caution of a woman who had buried a husband and a daughter and had exactly one person left in the world worth being careful about. Bailey understood the warning, even as she found herself more and more unable to keep walking past without at least glancing over. The mistake happened on a Tuesday in the first week of February. The cafeteria line at Jefferson Elementary moved faster than the woman serving trays could keep track of names, and somehow Bailey ended up holding 2 breakfast trays instead of 1. 2 biscuits, 2 little cartons of milk, 2 foil packets of grape jelly. She ate the first tray at her usual seat by the window. The second she wrapped carefully in a paper napkin and slid into her backpack, though she couldn't have said if anyone had asked her right then exactly why. She found out why 10 minutes later, standing in front of the shuttered dry cleaner with the wrapped biscuit in her hand, and her heart going faster than the short walk should have caused. The man was awake. He was always awake, she would learn later, or awake enough to seem it a habit built over decades that never fully switched off. His eyes were pale gray, sharper than she'd expected from a distance, the kind of eyes that seemed to take a person apart, piece by piece, before deciding whether they were worth speaking to. "You want this?" Bailey held the biscuit out at arm's length, ready to yank her hand back if he shouted, or worse if he didn't. He didn't shout. He looked at the biscuit for a long moment and then at her, weighing something she couldn't name. "That's kind of you," he said, finally. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like a door that hadn't been oiled in years. He took the biscuit with both hands, careful the way a person handles something they intend to make last. "Name's Walter." "Bailey?" He nodded once slow, as if filing the name away in some internal ledger. "You'd best get on to school, Bailey." She almost turned and walked away, right then back into the version of her morning where this corner didn't exist, where she was simply a girl on her way to third period, like every other day. But something about the way he'd said, "thank you," without asking for anything more, without the wheedling edge she'd braced herself to hear, made her feet stay planted a second longer than they needed to. "You want coffee tomorrow?" she asked, surprising herself with the offer. "My grandma always makes too much." His eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Black's fine." Ruth was salting a pot of beans on the stove that evening when Bailey told her the way Bailey told her everything flatly, without dressing it up, laying the facts down, one after another like cards. There's a man who sleeps by the dry cleaner on Ashland. I gave him my extra biscuit today. Ruth's spoon paused halfway to the pot. What man? His name is Walter. Bailey. Ruth set the spoon down against the rim, her voice sharpening into the register she used for things that scared her. You don't go talking to strangers on that corner. You hear me? Man could be anybody. I already talked to him. Ruth pressed her palm flat against the counter, a habit Bailey recognized the thing her grandmother's hands did when she was deciding whether to be angry or afraid and hadn't yet chosen which. I don't like it, Ruth said. He said thank you, Bailey answered. Like he meant it, not like he was trying to get something else out of me. Ruth didn't respond right away. She turned the burner down low and stood there a moment thinking of her own mother, decades back ladling soup out the kitchen door to men riding the rail line through their town during a winter nobody in that house could afford to be generous in, and doing it anyway. She thought of Nathaniel, gone 5 years. Now her husband, a man who used to say almost the same thing about strangers on porches. You don't know what a person's carrying till you've fed him once. Fine, Ruth said at last. But I'm coming Saturday. I want to see this man for myself before I let you keep at it. Bailey didn't argue. She went to bed that night thinking not of Walter exactly, but of the jar under her bed, running the numbers the way she always did before sleep, $36, $9 short, and 3 months still standing between her and the deadline circled in blue pen on the inside of her closet door. By the last week of February, the morning had folded itself into a shape that felt to Bailey like it had always existed. 6:15. A thermos of coffee, black cap tight against the cold. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper. 10 minutes of talk before the crossing signal at the corner turned, and she had to run the rest of the way to make the first bell. Walter was always awake by the time she arrived, sitting straight-backed against the brick, as if the wall itself were something he'd been assigned to guard rather than simply lean against. You eat all that? He asked her once, nodding toward the half sandwich she hadn't finished, the peanut butter one she was supposed to be eating on her own walk. I'm not that hungry in the mornings. He didn't push it. He never pushed anything. Not questions, not opinions, not the thin edge of curiosity Bailey sometimes caught crossing his face before he tucked it away again. He asked in his own slow time about her school, about the drawings she sometimes showed him, about the dog she walked for money. She asked about his days, and mostly he deflected the way a man deflects things he's decided not to carry into daylight until one gray morning in late February. Staring past her at the empty street, he said almost to himself, used to keep a schedule just like this one, before dawn every single day, no matter the weather. He didn't explain further, and Bailey, without being taught, understood that some doors in a person only opened part way, and that pushing on them only made them swing shut again, sometimes for good. She noticed other things too, the way children notice details adults have long since stopped seeing. The way Walter folded his blanket into a perfect square each morning, corners squared off with a precision that had nothing to do with comfort. The way he sat, with his back straight, even when no one was watching, as if slouching were a habit he'd trained out of himself decades ago and never allowed back in. The way he counted things under his breath, sometimes footsteps, car horns, the seconds between one streetlight changing and the next, like a man keeping himself steady by giving his mind a job to do. Why do you count things? She asked him once, midway through March, after catching him murmuring numbers to himself while she poured his coffee. Walter looked faintly surprised she'd noticed. Keeps a man's head where it belongs, he said. Idle thinking gets a person into trouble. Better to count something true than let your mind wander somewhere it shouldn't. Bailey didn't fully understand what he meant, but she filed it away, the way she filed away most things he said, not to be solved, right then, but kept the way she kept pencils long after they'd worn down to stubs, too short to hold properly on the chance they might still turn out useful. Ruth came that Saturday exactly as she'd promised, arms folded across her chest, standing a few careful feet back from the doorway, where Walter sat studying him the way she studied second-hand furniture at the church sale, checking first for the damage, the rot underneath the paint. "Morning," Walter said. Nothing more. He didn't perform gratitude for her benefit, didn't fill the silence with the kind of talk a man puts on when he's trying to be liked. He simply accepted the coffee Ruth held out and drank it and let the quiet stretch. It was that silence more than anything he might have said that started to change her mind. A man performing helplessness filled every gap in conversation with words, angling for sympathy the way water finds a crack. Walter filled his gaps with nothing at all. He didn't need her to feel sorry for him. He seemed, if anything, faintly embarrassed by the coffee itself. "You served," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Something in the way he held his shoulders, even bent low with age and cold, gave the fact away before he could hide it. Walter's eyes flicked toward her, then back to the street. "Long time ago. My husband did too. Is that right?" He said it quietly, and something in his tone told her the sentence was meant to close a door, not open one. Ruth didn't press further that morning, but she stopped forbidding the visits after that Saturday. By March, she was packing an extra sandwich herself some mornings without Bailey having to ask, wrapping it in the same wax paper her own mother used to use out of some instinct she couldn't fully name. It was Walter who brought it up first on a raw morning in the middle of March, staring past Bailey at a street empty except for a delivery truck idling 2 blocks down. "Cold like this reminds me of a hill I sat on once," he said, turning his coffee cup slowly between his palms. "Winter of '51, Hill 204 they called it. Wasn't much of a hill, really, just a place men died on." Bailey didn't understand the weight sitting inside those words, only that his voice had changed shape, flattened out, gone somewhere far from the sidewalk they were sitting on. "What happened there?" "Held a position," he said, "longer than I had any business being able to." He glanced at the sketchbook tucked under her arm, the one she carried everywhere now. "You draw what you see, don't you? Sometimes what I imagine too. Draw that hill sometime," he said, "just so somebody besides me has got a picture of it." She didn't draw it that morning, but she carried the name home with her the way children carry odd, heavy words they don't yet understand, 204 turning it over in her mind on the walk to school without any sense yet of why it mattered or to whom. By the middle of March, Bailey's teacher, Patricia Moore, had begun watching the lunch line more closely than she let on. She noticed the pattern before she understood the shape of it. Bailey skipping most of her tray, claiming she wasn't hungry, then folding her dinner roll into a paper napkin and sliding it into the front pocket of her backpack instead of eating it. "Bailey." Ms. Moore crouched down to her eye level in the hallway one Thursday afternoon, voice gentle but direct. "Are you eating enough at home?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're not finishing your lunch, though. Not most days." "I'm saving it." "For what won't?" Bailey hesitated, not because she had anything to hide, but because the truth felt too large and strange to explain in a hallway between periods, and that hesitation brief, as it was said, more to Ms. Moore than any answer could have. That afternoon, out of genuine and reasonable concern, rather than any wish to cause harm, Ms. Moore filed a note with the school's family support office. A 10-year-old skipping meals, she wrote, might simply be a household running short on food. It seemed to her the responsible thing to flag. Ruth sat across a scratched laminate table from a caseworker named Ms. Bennett in an office that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old carpet, a manila folder open between them. "There's no accusation being made here," Ms. Bennett said, careful with each word. We just want to understand what's happening at home. What's happening? Ruth said, keeping her voice level, though her hands were not quite steady in her lap. Is that my granddaughter has decided on her own to save part of her lunch for a homeless veteran 3 blocks from where we live. Not because there isn't food in our home, because she chose to. Ms. Bennett glanced down at her notes, then back up. That's not quite what the report described. Ask her yourself. She's right outside. They did. Bailey answered exactly as she answered everything plainly, without embellishment or defensiveness, laying out the facts the way she laid out everything else. By the end of the short meeting, Ms. Bennett closed the folder without opening a formal case. For what it's worth, she said at the door, glancing at Bailey. That's a remarkable kid you're raising. Ruth didn't let herself smile until they were 3 steps outside the building. The cold snap arrived without warning in the first week of April, a freak drop into the low 30s for 4 straight nights, unusual enough that the local news anchors mentioned it twice on the same broadcast, calling it a record for the date. Bailey found Walter shivering under a single blanket. That Thursday morning, his hands drawn so far up into his sleeves they had disappeared entirely, his breath coming out in short, visible clouds. You're freezing, she said. I've had worse. That's not an answer. She thought about the jar under her bed, the whole walk to school that day, running the arithmetic over and over the way she always did. $36, 5 more Saturdays before the deadline. If she gave up 2 weeks of saving, spent what she already had, instead of adding to it, after the last bell she walked into Second Chance Thrift on Ashland with $14 folded twice in her fist and came out 20 minutes later carrying a wool-lined coat, men's size large, the kind of navy blue that had gone soft and pale at the collar from years of wear before it ever reached the second-hand rack. She didn't tell Ruth what it had cost her until she'd already handed the coat to Walter the next morning, watching him pull it on, slowly testing the give of the sleeves. Didn't have to do that, he said. I wanted to. He studied her for a long moment, the same careful, weighing look he'd given her the very first day. Your mother raised you, or your grandmother? Both, I guess. Mom's gone now. Something crossed behind his eyes, then brief and unreadable gone before she could name it. I'm sorry to hear that, he said, and meant it in a way that felt different from the way people usually said it. That night, Bailey counted the jar again, though she already knew the number sitting inside it. $22. 23 short of the goal with barely a month left on the calendar, and no more Saturdays she could sacrifice without also missing the small, unspoken contributions she made toward the household every week, walking to school instead of asking for bus fare. Skipping the vending machine at lunch, small things that added up to something, even if nobody ever thanked her for them. She didn't cry. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long while, looking at the flyer taped inside her closet door, the deadline circled so many times in blue pen, the paper had gone soft there. Ruth found her sitting like that, and didn't ask what was wrong. She'd already noticed the empty thrift store bag hanging on the hallway hook, already understood. We'll figure something out, Ruth said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew the unpaid electric bill made that promise harder to keep than she wanted to admit. 2 nights later, Walter ran a fever. Bailey and Ruth found him disoriented on their Sunday visit to the clinic, where a passing outreach worker had finally gotten him admitted, mumbling fragments that didn't connect to anything in the room, coordinates, weather conditions, the names of men who weren't there. Hold the line, he muttered, gripping the edge of the blanket. Hold the line, Nathaniel. Ruth went very still, the coffee thermos in her hand tipped an inch before she caught it and set it down. What did you say? Her voice had gone thin. Walter blinked at her fever-glassed, not fully present in the room. Nathaniel, he said again, more urgently this time. Tell him to hold the line. Ruth said nothing else that visit. But she didn't sleep that night, lying awake beside the space in the bed that had been empty for 5 years, now turning her husband's first name over and over in her mind, wondering how many men named Nathaniel had ever held a line on a hillside in Korea and how many of them had come home afterward to marry a woman named Ruth. Ruth sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, staring at the photograph of her husband on the hallway table until the frame blurred in her tired eyes. Nathaniel had died 5 years earlier, quietly, in the recliner in the front room, a man who spoke about the war only in fragments and only late at night, and only when he believed no one else was listening. Hold the line, Nathaniel. Those weren't ordinary words to stumble into by accident. Nathaniel himself had said something close to it once, years into their marriage, half asleep, and mistaking her for someone else. In the dark, I held it. I held it because he told me to. She had never asked who he was. In 30 years of marriage, she had learned which doors in her husband stayed shut for a reason, and she had respected those doors the way she respected locked rooms in other people's houses. Now a stranger, 3 blocks from her front door, sweating through a fever, had said her husband's given name like it belonged to him too. On Sunday, Ruth went back to the clinic, alone without Bailey, and sat beside Walter's cot. Once the fever had broken enough to leave him lucid. He looked smaller in daylight, the thin hospital blanket pulled to his chest, his hands folded on top of it like a man already rehearsing for a coffin. You said my husband's name, Ruth told him. No greeting first, no softening the approach. Walter turned his head slowly toward her. Come again. Nathaniel Davis. Friday night. You called out for him, told him to hold the line. Something shifted behind Walter's eyes, not confusion exactly, but recognition, arriving from a long way off, the way a name surfaces slowly from deep water. De Davis? He repeated, testing the shape of it in his mouth. Young fellow. Nebraska, I think, or maybe Kansas, kept a photograph of a girl folded up in his boot the whole time. Wouldn't tell anybody who she was. Ruth's hand rose to cover her mouth. That was me, before we were married. Walter closed his eyes. For a long stretch, he said nothing at all, and Ruth wondered whether the fever had taken more out of him than the doctors were willing to admit yet. Hill 204, he said finally. Winter of 51. Whole company was pulling back, and the line was collapsing on the left flank. I told the lieutenant I'd hold the gun position while the rest of them got clear. He opened his eyes again. Your husband was one of the last men through that gap. I watched him go. Never knew what became of him after that. Never even knew if he made it out of the country alive. He made it out, Ruth said, her voice cracking on the last word before she could stop it. He came home. He married me. He raised a daughter. He held our granddaughter the day she was born. She had to pause, pressing her knuckles hard against her lips. He never once told me your name. I don't believe he ever knew it himself. Wouldn't have, Walter said. Nobody used names much up on that ridge. Too much chaos for names. He looked up at the ceiling instead of at her. 6 hours I sat on that position. Got recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross afterward. Colonel signed off on the paperwork himself, said he'd never seen anything quite like it in his years of service. What happened to it? Walter's jaw tightened, the first real flash of anger Ruth had seen cross his face since she'd known him. Board downgraded it, handed me a bronze star instead. He let that sit in the air a moment. Paperwork said the witnesses weren't considered reliable. Every man who could have spoken up for me on that ridge was colored. Wasn't 1951's idea of reliable testimony. Ruth sat with that for a long, heavy moment, understanding arriving in layers, first the raw injustice of it, and then slower, the shape of 70 years of a man's life stacked on top of a single clerical decision, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. He never knew, Walter said quietly. Your husband. Never knew what happened to that recommendation afterward. A man doesn't usually find out the fellow who saved his life got downgraded on account of the color of the men standing beside him. He isn't here to know it now, Ruth said. But I am. Walter looked at her then, and for the first time since she'd known him, something like hope crossed his face, thin and uncertain, the kind of hope that had learned a long time ago not to trust itself too much. Didn't tell you any of this, looking for pity, he said. I didn't come here asking for pity, Ruth answered. I came asking for the truth. There's a difference. She left the clinic that afternoon without telling Bailey everything yet. But that night, for the first time in 5 years, she pulled the old cedar box down from the top shelf of the closet, the box holding Nathaniel's discharge papers, his photographs, the folded flag from his burial, and began page by page to go through everything inside it. Walter improved enough over the following 2 weeks to sit upright in a chair by the window of the long-term care wing, though the nurses had started speaking to Ruth in the hallway with the particular gentleness reserved for families who needed to begin preparing themselves. Bailey visited every Wednesday and Sunday, often carrying a new drawing folded into her sketchbook. Walter, as she'd first seen him against the brick wall, Walter wearing the navy coat she'd bought him, Walter, with his eyes closed the way he looked when he was listening to something only he could hear. On the first Sunday in May, he asked her to pull her chair in close. I want you to have something, he said, working a thin chain free from beneath his collar, with fingers that trembled more than they used to. 2 metal tags hung from it, their edges worn smooth from decades of handling. He pressed them into her palm and folded her fingers closed around them. These are mine now, Bailey said, not quite a question running her thumb over the stamped letters. They are. His voice had gone rough. There's an envelope in the drawer beside you, sealed. You don't open it, not unless something happens to me, and if it does, I need you to make sure it gets mailed. Not thrown out with the rest of it. Mailed. Who's it going to? Anybody left who still remembers Hill 204, Walter said. Your grandmother will know what to do with it when the time comes. Bailey looked down at the tags cooling in her palm, then back up at him, a tightness rising in her throat. She didn't yet have the words for, You're not going to die. Everybody does eventually. He said it without cruelty, only plain fact. I've had a longer run than most men get handed. I'm not afraid of it. I just don't want whatever's left to say going to waste. He held her gaze. You understand me. I promise, Bailey said. I'll mail it. He nodded, once satisfied, the same slow nod he'd given her the very first morning she'd told him her name, as if something important had just been logged and secured somewhere safe. She didn't tell him about the $14, or the coat, or the flyer taped inside her closet door, with its deadline now only days away, and completely out of reach. It didn't feel like something to carry into that room. She had made her choice back in April, without knowing any of what she knew now, and some part of her, sitting there, with his dog tags cooling in her fist, understood clearly that she would make the very same choice again. Walter Johnson died in his sleep on the night of May the 10th. A nurse found him the next morning, with the window blinds still open the way he liked them, so he could watch the sky lighten before dawn broke properly over the parking lot outside. Ruth got the call at 6:20 that morning, standing in her kitchen, in her robe, the coffee pot still filling behind her. She set the pot down without waiting for it to finish, and sat at the table a long while before she went upstairs to wake her granddaughter. Bailey didn't cry right away. She dressed for school, as she did every morning, packed her bag, and it wasn't until she reached into her closet for her jacket that she saw the flyer still taped there. Fairview Community Art Center, summer session, registration deadline, Friday, May the 12th, 2 days from a morning that no longer needed to arrive on time for anything at all. She sat down on the floor of the closet, the dog tags looped beneath her shirt, and cried the specific, wordless way a child cries, when she has lost two things on the same morning and doesn't yet have language sturdy enough to hold both at once. Ruth found her there 20 minutes later and didn't try to fix it. She lowered herself onto the floor beside her granddaughter, back against the closet wall, and wrapped an arm around her shoulders and let the silence between them do what silence sometimes manages better than any words could. "He gave me something," Bailey said, finally her voice thick. "An envelope. He said if anything happened to him, I had to make sure it got mailed." "Then we'll mail it," Ruth said. "Mailed to who?" Ruth thought of the cedar box of the pages she'd spent 2 weeks reading and rereading by lamplight of a name she'd found scrawled in the margin of an old discharge letter, a captain who had once tried and failed to set a wrong right. "I think I might know," she said quietly. "Come on, let's go see." The envelope Walter had left behind held two things: a short letter written in handwriting that shook more than it once had, and a black and white photograph, its edges soft with age, showing a row of young soldiers standing on a hillside, squinting into weak winter light. The letter read simply, "To whoever still remembers Hill 204, I am not writing this for myself. I am writing it because a girl named Bailey Davis fed me breakfast for 5 months and never once asked what I used to be. I want it on record, somewhere official, that men like the ones in this photograph existed and that what was done to their names afterward was wrong. If nobody ever reads this, that's all right by me. She already knew who I was, and that was enough. Walter Johnson, Sergeant Company B, 24th Infantry Regiment." Ruth read it twice at the kitchen table, then rose and pulled from the cedar box the letter she'd found 2 weeks earlier, a carbon copy of a formal complaint dated 1952, addressed to the Army Board for correction of military records, signed by a Captain Daniel Anderson. "I witnessed the actions of Sergeant Walter Johnson on Hill 204. Personally," the old letter read. "I recommended the Distinguished Service Cross, and I stand by that recommendation without reservation. The downgrade to Bronze Star was made in my judgment on grounds that were prejudicial rather than evidentiary. I request this record be formally reviewed." Stapled beneath it sat a stamped rejection, dated 6 weeks later, offering no explanation beyond a single clipped line, insufficient corroborating testimony. Ruth sat with both letters laid out side by side on the table, 70 years apart, written by two men who could never have known that a single envelope would one day carry them both to the same kitchen at the same time. That night, she searched the name Daniel Anderson and found, after an hour of dead ends, a news article from 3 years earlier. Lieutenant General Vivian Anderson, sworn in to lead Army Review Board. The headline read, above a photograph of a woman in dress uniform, 4 stars gleaming on her shoulder. Buried in the third paragraph was a single sentence: Anderson has cited her late father, an Army captain, as her inspiration for a career devoted to correcting historical injustices buried in military record-keeping. Ruth printed the article with hands that weren't quite steady and placed both letters, Walter's and the captain's, into a single envelope addressed to the general's office in Washington, D.C. 3 weeks later, at 7:04 in the morning, a dark green government sedan pulled up outside the walk-up on Delancey Street. Colonel Reyes stepped out first, followed by 2 junior officers, one of them carrying a slim, aging folder against his chest. Across the street, Officer Taylor happened to be finishing a coffee outside the corner store, the very officer who 5 months earlier had kicked a homeless man's blanket into a gutter 3 blocks from this same address. He recognized the insignia on the colonel's shoulder before he recognized anything else about the scene, and something shifted in his posture, subtle but unmistakable. The way a man's does when he senses too late that he badly misjudged the true size of a story he'd only ever glimpsed the smallest corner of. Ruth opened the door, still in her robe, one hand instinctively finding Bailey's shoulder and drawing her close. "Mrs. Davis," the colonel said, "I'm Colonel Reyes. We need to speak with you about a man named Walter Johnson." She paused, glancing down at the folder in the junior officer's hands. "And about your husband." Bailey stood on the step behind her grandmother, sketchbook pressed against her chest, watching as the folder fell open just enough to reveal clipped inside its front cover a photograph she recognized instantly. Her own drawing of Walter, the one she had left pinned above his hospital bed, now traveling inside a government folder, as if it had quietly become evidence of something far larger than she had ever understood it to be. "General Anderson received your letter," the colonel said. "She asked us to come in person. She would very much like to meet your granddaughter." Across the street, Officer Taylor stood frozen, his coffee going cold in his hand, watching a scene whose full shape he still couldn't see, but already understanding the way a man senses weather before it fully arrives, that he had been wrong about something significant, and that the wrongness of it was about to become very public indeed. The Army Distinguished Service Cross Review Board convened in a wood-paneled room in Washington during the second week of July. Ruth sat in the front row of the gallery, in a navy blue dress, bought second-hand for the occasion. Bailey sat beside her, the dog tags tucked beneath her collar, her sketchbook closed in her lap for the first time in months. General Vivian Anderson opened the proceedings herself, her voice carrying easily across the room without need of the microphone in front of her. "My father spent the last 20 years of his life believing he had failed a man he once served beside," she said. "He died still trying to correct a record this Army refused to look at twice. I am not neutral in this matter, and I want that stated plainly for the transcript. I believe Sergeant Walter Johnson earned the Distinguished Service Cross in the winter of 1951, and I believe the reason he did not receive it has nothing whatsoever to do with the quality of his service." Charles Wilson, the board's senior records officer, rose next, his tone measured and entirely without malice. "General, with respect, we have no surviving witnesses left to this event. The men who stood on that hillside are gone. What we have before us is a photograph, 2 letters, and a second-hand account from a woman who never met the sergeant until the final months of his life. That does not meet the standard of corroboration this board has ever accepted before. Then perhaps this board's previous standard was itself the problem," Anderson answered evenly. Wilson didn't retreat. "I'm not disputing the injustice, General. I am telling you what the regulations as written require of us. If we approve this file without proper corroboration, we open every closed case in this building's basement to the same challenge." "Good," Anderson said, without missing a beat. "There are 41 other cases sitting in that basement archive that look exactly like this one. Perhaps it's past time they were challenged too." A low murmur moved through the gallery. Wilson held his position a moment longer, then took his seat, not defeated, so much as satisfied that his formal objection now sat safely on the record, which Ruth would come to understand only later had been the entire point of a man doing his job with honesty rather than cruelty. The board entered both letters into the official record, Daniel Anderson's 1952 complaint and Walter's final letter, read aloud by the general herself, her voice steady until the final 2 lines, which she read more quietly than the rest. "I want it on record that men like the ones in this photograph existed, and that what was done to their names afterward was wrong. She already knew who I was, and that was enough." When the chairman finally asked, as a matter of formality, whether anyone present wished to add anything further, before the vote, Ruth expected the question to pass over the room the way such questions usually did. Instead, Bailey stood up. The chairman glanced toward Ruth, who gave a single small nod, and then toward the 10-year-old girl, now standing very straight in the gallery, her hands folded in front of her, the careful, formal way she'd once seen adults do it on television. "I didn't know he was a soldier," Bailey said. Her voice was small in the large, echoing room, but it did not shake. "I just knew he was cold, and I had extra to give. He never asked me for anything more than that. He never told me any of this to make me feel sorry for him." She glanced down at her folded hands, then lifted her eyes again. "He doesn't need a medal to have been a good man, but I think he earned one anyway, and I think somebody should have said his name a long time before I ever did." She sat back down. For several long seconds, no one in the gallery spoke at all. The board voted that same afternoon, unanimously, to approve the posthumous award of the Distinguished Service Cross to Sergeant Walter Johnson. Before adjourning the session, General Anderson announced that the board would additionally reopen review of the 41 comparable cases involving black soldiers whose commendations had been quietly downgraded during the same period under what she called for the first time in public the Walter Johnson Fair Recognition Initiative. Reporters caught Ruth and Bailey on the courthouse steps afterward. Only one question among the shouted dozen landed anywhere close to true. "What made you keep feeding him all those months, not knowing any of this?" Bailey thought about it honestly before she answered. "He was just a person," she said. "That's all I ever saw. I still think that's all that mattered." The following September, the National Museum of the United States Army unveiled a new corner of its Korean War gallery, a formal Distinguished Service Cross, displayed in a glass case, beside a black and white photograph of young men on a snow-dusted hill, and beside that, a watercolor painting, an old man in a navy coat sitting against a brick wall, a paper cup of coffee steaming faintly in his folded hands. The placard beneath the painting read only Walter Johnson, 1936 to 2026. Painted by Bailey Davis, age 10. Fairview Community Art Center had reached out to Ruth back in June, once the story had run in 3 national papers offering Bailey a full scholarship to the following summer's session, no deadline. This time, no jar of saved dollars required. Bailey accepted, though she told Ms. Delgado she planned to keep saving anyway, just in case something else worth $14 ever came along again. Officer Taylor was placed on administrative leave that same month, following a department review sparked by an entirely separate complaint filed against him, unrelated technically, to Walter Johnson, though the timing did nothing to help his case, and the local paper ran both stories side by side on the very same page. On the morning of the museum's opening, Bailey stood in front of the painting. For a long time, the dog tags cool against her collarbone, while Ruth stood a few steps back watching her granddaughter, the way she used to watch Nathaniel quietly from a small distance, letting him have the moment fully without needing to stand inside it herself. "I still remember," Bailey said softly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the painting itself. Behind her, mounted on the opposite wall of the gallery, hung a formal portrait of the 24th Infantry Regiment, a row of young black soldiers whose names she would likely never learn except for one. Outside the city moved, on the way cities always do, indifferent and ordinary past sidewalks and street corners where other men still slept against other walls, still waiting, some of them for someone to notice that they had names at all.